Finding number 3 is sort of a grab bag finding. There's a lot of things in this. We actually have multiple slides, and I'm going to address each of them before talking about our suggested initiative. So what we're discussing with finding number 3 is that there are multiple dynamics that are shaping LGBTQ plus students' experiences in terms of their sexual interactions and their consent practices. And so we're going to kind of break these down one by one. The first is that participants understand sex expansively. And what we mean by that is beyond sort of what we might think of as cis heteronormative ideas of sex. They talked specifically about PDI, or penis vaginal intercourse, and they talked about sex in much more expansive ways. And what sort of correlated with that expansive understanding of sex was then an expanded understanding of consent. So understanding that consent needed to be given and received for acts such as oral sex or sexual touching, not just penetrative sex. And this is something that we think is important for us to understand as we're thinking about how LGBTQ plus students are engaging in sexual interactions and how they're navigating consent. Secondly, many participants reported engaging in affirmative consent practices, which we thought was really encouraging. In fact, nearly, if not all of our participants did talk about that, including such things as verbal communication, some both before and during sexual activity. So we thought that was really promising, and we wanted to sort of uplift that as something that we think is really encouraging to know that is happening for these students. A third piece that we want to talk about is this idea that we're developing in our analysis called sexual agency. So there were 3 behaviors in particular when we think about the affirmative consent practices that we heard students describe. And we are starting to think of them sort of in combination under this idea that we're calling sexual agency. So the first one of those is students understanding their own sexual wants and needs. So for example, we heard a lot of students talk about sexual pleasure, maybe for themselves, maybe for a partner, and maybe for both or all the people involved. We also heard a lot of students talk about good sex. And so hearing this sort of like emphasis on their sexual wants and needs was one of the markers that we understood to be indicative of sexual agency. Secondly, hearing students articulate a clear understanding of their own boundaries and a feeling of being able to empower to communicate that boundary. And so we did hear a lot of students talk about this in very different ways, and of course using their own words and their own language, but this is another element of this idea of sexual agency. And then third, that students feel that their partner or their partners will respect those boundaries. So to unpack this idea of sexual agency a little bit further, it's not necessarily something that we are understanding as static. In fact, some students, it's more of a continuum. So some students described exhibiting these behaviors in certain situations, and then other situations they didn't. So rather than thinking of the 30 students that we interviewed as either having high sexual agency or low sexual agency, we're using this as a tool to understand what is the development of this thing called sexual agency that we're imagining. How can we help foster the development of that among students as a protective factor? So moving on to our second slide of findings 3. In this slide, we're talking about the ways that, again, multiple dynamics are shaping these students' sexual interactions and consent practices. The next thing we're going to discuss is communication. And so the communication strategies that students spoke about, which included both verbal and nonverbal communication, definitely varied by context. One of the main ways that we saw that vary was if it was an instance where it was sort of a one-time sexual interaction, or a recurring or within the context of a long-term sexual partnership. Students were much more likely to talk about using explicitly verbal communication in one-time instances, or if it was a partner they were maybe more familiar with and they had understanding of what some of those nonverbal cues might be, they talked about in those situations feeling more likely that they might use nonverbal communication as they're navigating consent. Another factor in this sort of suite of findings is the use of hookup apps, or these are digital apps that students might use to find a sexual partner or a potential sexual partner. Some of our participants did talk about using sexual apps as a way to find a hookup apps as a way to find a potential sexual partner. And that did seem to have an impact on how communication happened, particularly in advance. And so one thing that we heard students talk about was, if I'm on an app and if I'm like texting back and forth with somebody, there's sort of an assumption that we're both interested in having sex. And so the conversation that we're having is different. It might be more a conversation around like, what are you into or what are you looking for? So perhaps maybe a more direct and sort of verbal conversation about what a sexual interaction might entail before those folks are even in the same space together. So in some ways, we were kind of surprised and like happy to hear that there was this protective mechanism happening around communication in advance of these kinds of hookups. Um, on the flip side of that, some students talked about how that advanced communication, if actually might have made it harder for them in the moment to change their mind. So if they had communicated to somebody that they were interested in a particular sexual experience, and then they got into the same space as that person or as those people, they might feel like less likely to want to change their mind. And so that was an interesting piece that we heard as well. And then another element, probably not a surprise to folks, is that multiple intersecting identity related power dynamics are certainly influencing students' sexual interactions. So we heard a lot of different anecdotal narratives, experiences that students shared, in particular related to race and ethnicity identities and experiences. We heard students talk about sometimes like cultural religious experiences too that were attached to a particular race or ethnicity identity. We also heard a lot of students talk about disability and how either mental health or chronic illness or other types of disabilities influence power dynamics. Students talked a lot about age. In particular, we heard a number of students talk about when they were younger or when they were first coming out, being in situations with an older or a more sexually experienced person where the power dynamic was certainly very felt to them. And then also looking at gender identity and expression. And this isn't just thinking along sort of like binary terms of like masculine, feminine, man, woman, but also thinking about the experiences of cisgender students compared to those of transgender and non-binary students, some very different power related dynamics emerging there. And then finally, sexual orientation. As a reminder, even though we're looking at all LGBTQ identified students, within that umbrella, there are a lot of different sexual orientations. And some of these students do have sexual partners who are not LGBTQ+. And so that's an important reminder that that's a power dynamic as well. Which moves us into our third slide of finding three, which is looking at some of the specific dynamics when a participant had a cisgender male partner or a cisgender man sexual partner. Primarily, we heard these narratives from bi, pansexual, and queer cisgender women, as well as trans and non-binary participants who talked about having a cisgender male sexual partner. And the way that they talked about those sexual interactions, we started to notice was distinct from the ways that they talked about sex with a queer partner. So one of the things that they described was that the cisgender men's reported conception of consent was different. And so that cisgender male sexual partner in the mind of the participant was understanding consent as really only needing to be applicable for penetrative sex. Another piece of that was the reported consent behaviors of the cisgender man sexual partner, in such that there were fewer check-ins as a sexual interaction progressed, as well as this idea of blanket consent, which was that once the cisgender man sexual partner has consent, that is sort of just applies throughout the duration of that interaction, rather than as different activities are engaged, having another consent conversation. Participants also talked about cisgender men's sexual partners' roles in guiding the interaction, sort of with the assumption then that his partner would follow his lead. And then finally, a prioritization in those particular sexual pairings of the cisgender man's sexual pleasure. So the suggested initiative that we're proposing that's attached to sort of this plethora of findings related to these unique dynamics is that there is a need to build awareness and develop skills for LGBTQIA+ students to become aware of some of these different dynamics and then navigate them, hopefully with a lot of success and effectiveness. This is a very broad suggested initiative, and we understand that it would probably contain multiple initiatives. And one of the things that we're particularly interested in is student-led efforts that are institutionally supported and resourced. So for example, an idea of that might be a seed grant initiative. So money to help students develop their own social norms campaigns to help them to navigate some of these power dynamics and different dynamics that they're navigating in sexual interactions. This could potentially be related to some of the sexual health curriculum that Carly just spoke about. So we imagine a connection there, but we don't imagine that this initiative is limited just to that. We imagine this initiative as being more broad reaching. And then finally, of course, we would need to work on developing this initiative in collaboration with other units on campus.